Admiral Winnefeld, welcome to Unfair Fight.
It's nice to be here with the very fair colleagues.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to this one for a while. I think last time we met, we were skiing at Beaver Creek with my little one. I hope to do it again.
Combat skiing, point your tips downhill and don't stop, right?
There we go. Let's hope for a good snow season out here in Colorado. Yeah. It's been a little light these years.
La Nina is its third year, so I'm, not too optimistic, but hopeful.
Yeah, I'm holding out hope because it's been a decently normal wet summer, or more wet. It's still dry as hell out here. But listen, I've been super excited to have you on. You're an absolute, legend in the military and national security circles, and have done amazing work and dedication to our country. And I really want to just obviously, kind of hear your story and kind of some insights in current events as well. Obviously, there's a lot going on in the world. It's a rather unstable time, but kind of set the stage. I never heard the story. I mean, obviously, I'm very familiar with your military career, having served in the intelligence community for 12 years or so. How'd you get in? How'd you get started? Like, what led you to serve?
Yeah, my dad was a Navy pilot. But I was a rebellious teenager, so I wasn't really sure that's I wanted to follow in his footsteps. But we were at one point when I was a senior in high school, in between summertime, I was working as a carpenter outside, and I saw these F-14s flying around the pattern at Naval Air Station Oceana, and I went, that looks like it might be fun. So I demanded that my dad take me to see one, and I got to sit in the cockpit, and then the thing looked like it was going 1,000 miles an hour sitting on the ground. I said,
right.
And there was a guy's name painted on the cockpit. It's kind of like, I'll bet that guy has a lot of fun. I think I might try for that. And so I turned down the Naval Academy and went to Georgia Tech on an ROTC scholarship. But my whole goal all along, I knew what I wanted to do, which really helped me get through college.
Right.
Luck and whatever got me to my dream of being able to fly F-14. So it's cool.
That's incredible. It's a big plane. I've seen it in person. I've seen it fly. I was always shocked, I first saw it as a kid, and I couldn't believe how large, of a plane it actually was. It was pretty shocking in person.
Yeah, it was a big airplane, especially with the wings spread,
right.
And it makes it a little easy to see in combat. But it was pretty far ahead of its time when it first came out.
Right.
And it was in service for a long time. I flew the last day combat sortie in an F-14 over Iraq in 2006. So it was in service for a long time, but it needed to go because it was frankly too expensive to maintain.
Right. That's, I guess, one of the challenges. You need you can have amazing capability, especially with new planes. I would think like the F-22, but it seems like a Formula One car with the amount of effort it needs to get it off the ground and maintenance each time. And it's obviously an amazing
and at some
platform.
point, the memory we had in the very first version of the Tomcat was less than you had in an Apple IIc. Kind of like the space shuttle had really, really old memory, right? And so when they wanted to do a software upgrade, they had to really work hard on it to try to pack everything they could into that little memory. As the airplane matured and the F-14D came out, we had a little better capability. But it was, it spanned, that fourth and fifth generation of fighters.
Sure. So when you were in college, my sister actually went to Notre Dame, joined Air Force ROTC, and ended up flying C-21s. I think she flew the KC-10 as well as instructor pilot on that, and flew in, Iraq and Afghanistan. Is there a major that makes you more predisposed to kind of the pilot track? I mean, I know she was a math major from what I remember.
Yeah, we have a lot of fighter pilots are history majors, but I will say that having an engineering degree is very helpful. Right. It just gets you more technically adept, and you're able to more quickly understand some of the more technical aspects of radars and weapon systems and how the airplane works. And I was an aerospace engineer at Georgia Tech, so I, pretty much cruised through the ground school.
Right.
But at the end of the day, there's much more to being a fighter pilot than having an engineering degree. It's a combination of skills and motivations and training that make you either good or average.
Right. Yeah. When we were chatting before and we were talking about your podcast, and you mentioned you had Joseph Newgarden on, I don't know if you know, but I race cars for fun. And so obviously racing, I'm a massive fan, a huge IndyCar fan, because I think, I love Formula One as well, but as far as all the series, that is still raw, no power steering.
Yeah, no power steering in those Indy cars. And it was just really fun to talk to him about how he has matured as a driver, how he approaches taking risk, and what it's like to basically be driving, 200 and some miles an hour, inches away from another car.
Yeah.
And knowing who's in that car and how you might treat them differently, knowing that there's somebody else, in a different car.
Yeah.
But he was, and by the way, thanks for plugging it. It's the Adrenaline Zone is the name of the podcast. And he was one of our, I think, early episodes, but it was a lot of fun talking to him.
Yeah, that's what, and what made me think of that was when you mentioned kind of your engineering degree, and then you're in a very physical, kind of in your face, along with electronic warfare and everything. It's very cerebral, physical, and I kind of think race car driving is that way too, because sometimes the best drivers, they have to be fast. That's kind of default, but it's their knowledge to give accurate feedback to their crew, to get the setup and to get it fastest. And it's kind of like Niki Lauda. I mean, he was a half engineer and, ended up flying planes as well. Kind of post his
a lot of teamwork involved. Joseph will tell you that he's afraid of flying. But
really,
otherwise, kind of seems odd for a race car driver, but where the engineering degree helped me the most in my career was probably mid-career, 15 years in or so. I had to go through Navy nuclear power school, because by law, to command an aircraft carrier, you have to be a nuclear trained naval aviator. And that's a very hard school. It's like getting a master's degree in nuclear engineering. And so even though it was aerospace engineering, it was really helpful to have that education at that point.
Right. Yeah, that's the nuclear game is wild. That was a lot of my background as well, maybe more on the weapons side. So I had to learn a lot about that, and it's absolutely fascinating and terrifying when you kind of consider a lot of the saber rattling that's going on these days. Understanding a little bit more about these platforms.
Absolutely.
It's pretty wild. That you obviously had a lot of history. It was my understanding you went to, kind of Top Gun school. What's the real name for the program? I know Top Gun's kind of the name everyone knows, but I feel like it has a different name.
It's called the Navy Fighter Weapons School.
Okay.
And the short moniker is Top Gun. I went there as a student and then came back as an instructor for 3 years. So it was one of the most fun tours of my whole career.
It has to have been. Is the format one where when you come in as a student, the idea, now this is like a, 13 plus week or 13 or so week program, somewhere around there?
Actually, when I went through and when I taught, it was either 5 or 6 weeks, depending on what year it was. But so it was a little shorter program. Okay. And back in the day when I was doing it, we would take an air crew from a squadron that was in situ. They would come through the class for 5 or 6 weeks, and then we were training the trainer, and they would go back and sort of be the standardization person in their squadron for fighter tactics. Nowadays, it's a little different, where we're training somebody sort of after their first tour, where they will now go back into a squadron for an entire tour as the training officer that is now steeped in this. And it's probably a smarter way of doing it. But it was really cool as a young fighter pilot to go through and really get this sort of graduate level education and being a fighter guy.
I could not imagine. The goal is for you to come back and then train your whole squadron, and kind of set the bar for them. How do you get selected?
Well, back when I did it, your squadron commander picked you. And now it's, I think, through the Navy's detailing system of how they assign officers, there's certainly a lot of reputation that goes into it. Your CEO probably has to, your first CEO has to write a recommendation, and you have to have a good reputation in the community before they'll take you. But, and back when I was there, you've heard of the Top Gun trophy, that they had in the first movie. Well, there was no such thing as the Top Gun trophy. In fact, we intentionally didn't want people to feel like they were competing with each other. But in fact, behind the scenes, because, they could do stupid things or, whatever. Behind the scenes, we actually had a list that we were keeping of people who would come through the class. And those were, we would look at every single one of them, and maybe one or two, if that, out of each class, we would put on that list as people we would be willing to have come back as instructors. And who knows, maybe that's still going on. But
so it's kind of
so we were self-selecting. Yeah. So that was kind of like the behind the scenes Top Gun trophy, that nobody knew about. And we didn't want the students to know about it, because one of the whole things we try to teach people is not only how to fight well on an airplane, but how to teach well on an airplane, and to keep the ego out of it. And to the point where we would even, when you're in the middle of describing this, spaghetti of a 1 versus 1, it wouldn't be, so why did you use the vertical right now? It would be more like, so what was the F-18 thinking? Right. To really keep the ego out of it. And that's one of the reasons why we have the best fighter pilots in the world between the Air Force, the Navy, and the Marine Corps. Right. Is because we're brutally honest with each other, but we keep our egos out of it. Most of the time.
It makes a lot of sense. Now, obviously, it doesn't tell the movie story as well. It's all ego and, kind of a pecking order. But you know what? It made me think of it at a lot lesser accomplishment level. I want to be very clear. But, I was a Division I athlete for University of Maryland. And it's kind of one of these things you can get sucked into in the gym. Yeah. Which is competing in the gym. And
you can hurt yourself.
The fastest way to get injured and be worse at what you do. So, but unfortunately, I don't think, from what I remember, we had we were definitely competing in the gym. Not productive, not efficient. So, it's kind of hard to separate the two. So you went to Top Gun school and you came back as an instructor. One thing I always wanted to know, because, I don't have a good view. I didn't, obviously, even in my career, had absolutely almost nothing to do with the kind of fighter pilot world. Did the instructors slay the students in training, or were there some students that could get one up on the instructors?
So pretty much at that point in your career, you've been through intensive training and an intensive instructor syllabus. So it would be pretty hard for a student to, take you out. But remember, some of the airplanes the students were flying were actually more capable than the aggressor airplanes we were flying. So if you're an F-18, you should be able to beat an F-5.
I see. I didn't realize there was different planes.
Yeah. So we, as instructors, we would fly A4s and F5s to simulate Russian airplanes, and then the students would be flying their airplanes. So they should be able to beat us. But sometimes, as an instructor, we would intentionally make a mistake to see if the student could pick up on it. And then how would they approach that in the debrief? Would they be able to teach us, with keeping the who out of it, so that we could learn? And so early on in the syllabus, we would, in the 1 versus 1 syllabus, we would pretty much whack them and then show how we would debrief, demonstrate to them how a good debrief looks. And towards the end of that, they were being forced, to debrief us, and we were grading them on how well they debriefed. As much as how well they flew their airplane. So,
this is something that I'm not sure you see it enough in professional sports, but I think some of the lessons learned, this is an elite performance lesson at the end of the day, right? What you're talking about is, can you go execute and have enough command of what you're talking about to give a super detailed, overview of what went right, what went wrong, how can you improve? And why? Because that means you actually are mastering it. It's kind of like complex subjects. If someone's supposed to be the expert and they can't break it down in simple terms, then they're probably not an expert because they can't.
Yeah, and back when we were doing it, you had to remember everything on a kneeboard card. And say in one flight, you might have 3 different fights and now you're having to go back and reconstruct a 3-dimensional, chess match on a 2-dimensional whiteboard. Nowadays, they still do that, but they have much better recording capability in the airplanes. So it's easier to kind of track, and they can also have a little more discipline on how they operated their weapon system and the like. So, as the planes get better, the training gets better.
Right. How big of it seems, I've been kind of reading up a lot on kind of fighter pilots and dogfighting and things like that. And it seems to me, as someone with really no knowledge on this, that the kind of electronic warfare component is a massive component in addition to your maneuvering. Is that true with the kind of how standoff we are with engagements, or is that, it seems like getting a dogfight's like the last thing you want to do.
Yeah, it's a really good question. Back when I first started as an instructor, it was almost inevitable that you would get to emerge, as we call it, and you'd end up in some sort of a dogfight. And that was when the Soviet airplanes really didn't have much of a capability to shoot you in the forward quarter. And they certainly didn't have much of a capability to shoot looking down at the ground because their radars couldn't see. They didn't have a very good Doppler radar. So, of course, as the Russians improved over time, they started to get this capability, and we had to adjust our tactics. And then other evolutions come along, like you now have missiles that can go into an active mode towards the end of their flight, which, so now you find these big, standoff engagements with air-to-air missiles that have tremendous ranges, that have active seeker modes, and you have radar cross-section that you're trying to manage in your own airplane, and you have electronic warfare where you're trying to prevent the bad guy from seeing you, and maybe you're trying to jam his radar. So it's gotten exponentially more complicated, even in the last 3 decades.
Right. Now, do you see, it seems like a 2-seat configuration would be ideal to have an electronic warfare officer, doing that thing. Now, how do you see this thing playing out between manned, unmanned? I've read about the loyal wingman sort of, concept. I'm just curious, as a expert in this field, where you see this going.
Well, there's no shortage of arguments.
Technical.
Yeah, there's no shortage of arguments between 2-seat airplane drivers and single-seat airplane drivers. But
right,
the 2-seat piece has its advantages. So, for example, in a 2-seat F-18 or F-15, you can run an air-to-air mission at the same time you can run an air-to-ground mission, and it's a little tough for one person to do that. Although it can be done, it's easier,
right.
And then if you're in a close air support role, it's easier, I think, to have somebody in the backseat managing several different engagements at once. But the airplanes are getting so capable. The F-35 is, the Air Force calls it a fat man in a magic suit.
Right.
But what it's a very stealthy airplane. But the real secret to that airplane is its systems and how they're stitched together. And you can foresee all kinds of artificial intelligence. The loyal wingman piece is just getting another layer of complexity and capability. And good news is, I don't think anybody in the world can keep up with this on that. The other guys are building pretty nice airplanes at this point, but they don't train as well as we do. They don't have the same systems inside. They don't have the same culture that we have in terms of debriefs and briefs and learning. So I'm confident that we still have a pretty good leg up on our adversaries, at least in the fighter business.
It's kind of the integrated view of the battle space that you have to operate in. Now, what do you think? I saw China's kind of new stealth plane, and clearly it looked like a large platform, and range was really important. So it seemed like its primary mission was kind of protecting, the homeland out at sea and engaging targets. And I read a lot of criticism on the F-35 on its, kind of power to weight ratio and this and that, but it seems like, there's trade-offs made, right, for stealth, electronic warfare, and packages. And it seems like that's kind of where the game is moving. It's not all about getting in, I guess, to the merges, you would say, right?
Yeah.
Is that kind of the thesis behind these platforms?
Yeah, it definitely is. And they're still good dogfighters, and you still have maybe a better pilot in the F-35. Right. So you've got that going for you. But it's also, they've stolen a lot of plans and the like for airplanes like that. But it's a huge difference between being able to have the plans and being able to actually make one.
Right.
It seems simple, but it's not. And then having, Manfred von Richthofen said, it's not the crate that matters, but who flies it. Right. And I think there's a difference in there as well. We have massive exercises like Red Flag,
right?
Top Gun in the Air Force Fighter Weapons School, and the like, WTI for the Marine Corps. And our guys are just really trained well. So, but technically, yes, our the integration of our systems, I think, would be hard to match anywhere in the world.
Right. What do you make of? I see a lot of articles, and I can't separate fact from fiction. And if you know and don't want to say, that's perfectly acceptable as well. I've been reading a lot of stuff more coming out of Chinese media that they've been able to solve seeing some of our stealth or low observable platforms. Do you see this as something that is like a game changer? We have to kind of rethink our strategy.
It's kind of spy versus spy, right? And, as we do one thing, they'll try to counter it. And there are wavelengths of radar where it is harder to be stealthy, and a stealth aircraft is generally designed for certain wavelengths. It's hard to design a stealth aircraft for the entire electromagnetic spectrum. And if in a lower frequency radar, something that might be more easily able to see a stealth aircraft, it might not get a precise track. It might not have a good enough track to do a fire control solution. But it's a constant battle. but we also keep getting better and better on the stealth side.
Well.
And
You're right. No, it makes sense. It made me think of, and this might be a horrible analogy from a tech standpoint, but like synthetic aperture radar is a really interesting way to raise, by digitally processing a lot of different signal points in time together to create an integrated picture. It feels like, radar systems to go against low observable platforms would be kind of a similar design where you can kind of reassemble, the image from multiple sources through computing and comms.
But for all the talk, I think in the few instances when we have operated our stealthy aircraft inside places like that, and without getting into anything classified, the F-22 operated over Syria, and there's some pretty sophisticated air defenses in there. I don't think they ever saw us.
Yeah, I agree. Good.
When we don't want to be seen, it's hard to be seen.
Let's keep it that way. So, kind of stepping back in time when you're in the Top Gun school, it was my understanding that you had some involvement with the original movie.
Yeah, I was there.
Fact or fiction? I don't. It's hard to separate out what's real or not.
Sure. Yeah, I was there when they filmed the movie, and
really,
varying levels of participation. We had one guy, Bob Willard, who ended up being a 4-star Admiral Commander of PACOM, who was sort of the principal interface with Paramount Studios and helped them rewrite the script, which desperately needed to be rewritten.
Really?
And so that was a deep, intense level involvement on his part. And then there were some of us who flew a couple of times or participated in one way or another. But what was really fascinating for me, because the flying in that first movie was a little boring. I mean, it wasn't, because the technology of the cameras at the time were not good enough to catch the real violence of air-to-air combat. Right. But what was fascinating to me is watching them make the movie on the ground, where they would do things, and I would say, these people are idiots. This is never going to work. Right. And then you see it on the screen, and you go, "Wow, they're That's brilliant. Amazing. They really do know." So it's a good lesson on, a real professional. Be careful how you judge a real professional, because they really are good.
Right.
And then now you zoom forward to the most recent movie. And, there are some, if you're steeped in the fighter business, there are some cringeworthy moments in there where you go, okay, that was kind of not real. Right. But you also realize they had to do it that way in order for the audience to see it. So, for example, if you're going to evade a radar-guided missile, you're not going to use flares. You're going to use chaff. Right. But you can't see chaff. Right. So the audience wouldn't be able to see the, Tom Cruise deploying chaff. So they had him deploy flares. Okay, I don't have a problem with that. The effect is achieved for the audience.
Sure.
But what they really did well in that movie, I thought, was to capture the G forces in the cockpit while you're doing life, whatever it is you're doing. And so you get a little bit of appreciation for, you're trying to manage your fuel, you're trying to manage your weapon system, you're trying to navigate, you're trying to keep alert for other aircraft that are out there to be trying to clear, you're trying to not hit the ground, and you're doing all of this under 7 Gs. And you can just see it in Tom Cruise's face. I thought they did an exceptionally good job of capturing that.
Yeah, those G loads you guys endure. How long would you say you endure a G load that high?
Most of the scenes in the movie were he's flying down a canyon, so it's off and on when you're doing these turns back and forth. But if you're in a knockdown, drag out, let's say 1 versus 1 dogfight, where you're starting at, let's say, 20,000 feet and you end up on the deck, you could be under 6-7 Gs for several minutes. And so you've got your, and it's constant, and you've got your G suit, which is squeezing the blood from your legs and your stomach to try to get more blood into your brain. And you're also literally, and I don't know if they do this in the movie, but I think that you're literally grunting. It's a maneuver you do to tighten your stomach muscles, and you grunt, and you're really trying to keep the blood in your brain so you can continue to function. And if you don't do it right, you can pass out. Wow.
And what is that? I've read, is that called G-lock, where you go unconscious and
G-induced loss of consciousness?
Yeah. So, there's one of the things, when you were talking to Newgarden, I know one of the things on especially road courses, or a course like Mid-Ohio, which is a really physical sort of course. I've read these guys, especially the Formula One guys, because they carry a much higher G load, but probably less load in their hands. They say they can't really breathe under braking, which, they can pull 5 Gs and change under braking. Do you get that same sort of, sensation at airplane where you have to get a little breather from the Gs to be able to continue to breathe, or does your oxygen system help make that easier?
You're getting pure oxygen, which is helpful, but you just train yourself. And I don't want to make a fool out of myself simulating it right here, but you're kind of taking a sip of air, and then grunt, 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 and then taking a sip of air. So, and you just train yourself to do that, and you do it. The thing that Newgarden was interesting, because I did challenge him. I was like, hey, most people don't think of race car drivers as athletes, but it's quite physically taxing. And he goes, yeah, try to take like a 40 or 50 pound weight and hold it in front of yourself for 2 hours.
Yeah.
Because that's the forces on the steering wheel without power steering in the Indy cars that they're doing. And so they do a lot of physical training in order to make it through.
Oh, they do. I think there's a place called Pit Fit out in Indianapolis. A lot of these guys go to, which is, a lot of neck training and kind of obviously the wheel's a big deal. I know when Indy cars ran a high downforce, when it almost looked like they had boxes over the back wheels, it was a really high downforce kit. And on ovals, I just can't even imagine, and especially like bank super speedways. The
pilot, the driver doesn't feel the downforce. The downforce is just pushing the car down.
Right.
What he's feeling for G is both the vertical G as he takes the turn in the oval on a bank turn, but also the lateral G as he's going around.
That's the one that our cars don't pull many G's at all. But when I don't drive in a while, my neck is always sore. My butt is sore. Holding your feet in place, going around a turn, so you can actually operate the pedals well is always something that I noticed. Well, I could talk about this forever, but
and you get out of an airplane after a very intense hour and a half flight where there's a lot of high G training. It's pretty tiring. And
you guys get back
do that
problems?
3 times a day.
I can't imagine.
The people who get back problems are ones who have had to eject out of an airplane, and we're not maybe a little bit out of position when they ejected, because it's a pretty good jolt, and it's a sharp vertical jolt right up the rails, which is a different sensation than this gradual onset of kind of 7 Gs. It might be 15 Gs straight up the rail
instantly.
Yeah, so there are some people who injure their backs doing that.
And now when you launch off an aircraft carrier, I've driven a dragster before, and I was shocked at wow, that was maybe I don't like dragster stuff, but my stomach was absolutely in my throat on the launch. Is it a similar sort of pace?
Well, I've never done a drag car, but it's a pretty good pace. It's a heavily loaded, say, Tomcat on a hot day where the wind is light. They have to set the steam setting on the catapult pretty high, and you'll be going from 0 to 150 in 3 seconds. So
that's pretty quick.
Think a modern electric car, a Tesla or BMW, that's got full electric, can go 0 to 60 in maybe 3.5 or 4.
Right.
Here you're doubling that acceleration. So on one of those cat shots, which last about 3 seconds, towards the end of the catapult shot, sometimes I've been thinking, I don't know how much longer I could do this, but I know it's going to end. And then, and then it's over and suddenly you're flying and you just go, man, that was so cool.
That's amazing. Yeah.
In the daytime. At night, it's kind of like, yeah, that was cool, but I got to get the hell away from the water because it's black out here.
Oh, I can't imagine. Couldn't see anything.
Yeah.
That's incredible. It's fascinating. Sorry, I could talk about this stuff forever. I'm so much more curious. Obviously, we're going to get on to current events, but I did want to touch on one piece of your history. I had Mike Morell on here a couple of weeks ago, and he shared some really interesting kind of experiences when 9/11 happened. Obviously, he was a presidential daily briefer at the time. What I didn't realize at the time was once we killed bin Laden, Mike was sent, along with, I think the commander of J3 and the kind of intelligence officer who will not name, to brief President Bush and Laura Bush on the operation first. And I thought that was a really cool story.
Nice.
I actually hadn't heard that Obama pushed him to go do that. But it was my understanding, I believe you were, commanding the was it the USS Enterprise or at the time? Talk to me about, kind of how you learned what happened there and what'd you do next? I mean, obviously it had to be a little bit shocking.
Sure. So we were at the end of a routine deployment. We had spent 3 months in the Mediterranean, 3 months in the Arabian Gulf, and had a couple of really successful strikes into Iraq. And then it was time to go home. And we were literally a day out of the the Strait of Hormuz, heading south as fast as we could go because we were on our way to the first ever port visit by a nuclear powered aircraft carrier to South Africa. And so everything was buttoned up. The airplanes are all, as buttoned up as they can be, lots of them in the hangar bay, and I got a phone call. It was 3 o'clock in the afternoon, which was 9 o'clock in the morning here, East Coast time. Right. And my safety officer said, Captain, you need to turn the TV on, and turned it on. And the first tower had been hit. And I was listening, the commentators were a little confused. Was this a terrorist act? Was it an accident? Whatever. And I saw the second literally live, saw the second airliner hit the second tower. And so it was clear to me that we weren't going anywhere. There's a little folklore out there that I sort of threw my white scarf over my shoulder and ordered Enterprise into a turn, and we headed up towards Pakistan. That's right. Not how things work in the real world. Right. We had a conversation with a couple of admirals, and including one on our ship, and were ordered to be off the coast of Pakistan as soon as possible, the next morning. So what I was probably most proud of there was when you're the leader of a large organization, people bring you problems from inside their stovepipe. So I had a navigation team that was telling me, well, Captain, we got to go 25 knots in order to get to our station when we're supposed to be there. Sure. And the aircraft maintainers are saying, well, Captain, we've got to run elevators all night long, because we got to get our airplanes ready to fight tomorrow. And we can only run elevators at 20 knots because for safety. Because if you go into a turn, you could dig one of those things in. And so there's this big struggle. And I go, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to go 30 knots
right.
and we'll position all the airplanes on our 4 elevators. And when it's time to move them, we'll slow down to 20 and we'll lower the the elevators and bring them back up. And then we'll reaccelerate to 30 and we'll average 25 knots. And it was like one of those dumb things, but sometimes, the person who's in charge is the one who has the solution. So we did that. And the next morning we were ready to fight. Of course, it took a month while the diplomacy worked its way out. Of course. But a little known fact is that the operating areas we had in the North Arabian Sea off of Pakistan were named for, the World Trade Center towers, the Pentagon, and of course, the area in Pennsylvania. And we had one called FDNY, one called NYPD. So it was very, we were very attached. It was the first time many of us had felt that we were safer at sea out there forward than our families were at home. Because if you remember, there were rumors all over the place. They're going to poison the water supply. They're going to do all these other things. So it was a pretty surreal time, but it was, nobody was upset about not being able to go home on time. We all wanted to be part of
I can't imagine. It's something I always think about. There's always this push pull between national security operations and how much you talk about it, and for obvious reasons, right? But one of the things I always felt that's really important, and why movies like Top Gun I actually think are so important, and sometimes getting our special operators out to talk a little bit more. I understand the code and everything, but there's a point to recruiting.
Yeah, I totally,
so many
totally
people
agree.
come in the best because they see whether it's a Top Gun fighter pilot or an operator. I want to be that guy because I'm wired that way, or I think I'm wired that way. And I
John,
think,
it's a terrific point, John. And we yesterday we recorded episode 1 of season 3 for our podcast, and it was a Navy nuclear submarine captain who and the reason we wanted to talk to him is because he spent a lot of time under the ice, and we felt like, hey, being under the ice is pretty risky, so we want to talk to somebody who's had that kind of adrenaline rush. And it was really good. Obviously he was very careful not to talk about classified things,
of course,
but it was really interesting. And if I was a 18, 19, 20-year-old kid listening to that, I might go, hey, I might want to be a submariner someday. So you're absolutely spot on. And I think if the special operators can talk about things that do not compromise their tactics, techniques, and procedures, then, that's better for all of us.
Yeah, I agree. I obviously we're extremely careful. I struggle with what we couldn't even talk about, to be candid with.
In your world, you can't say anything. Come on.
We can't say anything. We don't. We have the most benign, boring conversations. I wish we could tell some of the stories. It'd be really cool. People would love it, but I guess you have to use your imagination. So, obviously, so entering into kind of the war on terror, technology played a massive role in helping us navigate that, and especially with kind of targeting operations. We're kind of, whether it's going against ISIS or Al Qaeda. The thing I'm curious about is, during your time in the military, there's a lot of I remember the phase when like cyber warfare was like the hottest thing. And I feel like people were making some really grandiose claims as far as the impact it can truly have. To me, I'll just give you my opinion first, is I think many times it's an amazing IO weapon. You can really shape people's perceptions powerfully through it. I think we watch it in our own country as well. I find it an amazing economic and logistics disrupting weapon. But maybe using cyber to take out air defenses, I'm not sure I'd ever trust it, right? Because it's not like a repeatable thing. But I'm curious, was there a time, and something that you could mention or talk about, where, you know, you really saw a large impact from the cyber domain, you know, on national security missions, or even kind of on our own nation? I know it's kind of an open-ended question, but I think I'd love to hear practical real world stuff as opposed to all the theory stuff.
Yeah. And I would say it hasn't been often,
right?
But it's been effective in the short term. And, I really can't talk about the specific instances of which I'm aware. Yeah. But one of the things that is a sort of a principle with covert action, and this is kind of covert action, right? Is that in some cases it can be very beneficial in the near term, but not beneficial in the long term. And you can find that some of the things you do in the short term actually work, but then maybe not such a good effect further down the road. So you just have to be careful with that. It doesn't mean don't do covert action. You know, there's definitely a place for that, but it just means being careful with that. And I think your point about IO is really, really important. And when you think about because when I talk to an audience, I really try to separate the sort of idea of cyber warfare from information warfare, because much, if not most, of information warfare is conducted against our country using perfectly legal means. Right. You know, Facebook bots, you know, or whatever. Yeah. And that's not cyber war. It's not hacking into somebody's system and doing something. So I really try to distinguish those. And we know that actors such as Russia, China, North Korea, Iran have been doing this to us, and they're using our freedoms against us. So the question, you know, obviously you want to defend against that as well as you can. There's a very pregnant question right now that, in my mind, that says, should we be able to do that to them? And it's hard for somebody who lives in a free country to sign up for that, right? Because, hey, we don't want people doing it to us. Why would we do it to them? Well, we don't want somebody sending nuclear weapons our way either, but we have them, you know, as a deterrent. So if you develop the capability to show, say, Xi Jinping or Vladimir Putin or Ayatollah, you know, that, you know, if we really wanted to, we could interfere in your society. We're not going to do it because we believe this is something that has to be under presidential control. It's so important. And again, we won't do first use here, but if you do it to us, we're going to do it to you. And guess what? When you have regime change in the US, it's called an election, and the losers go off and work in think tanks. When you have regime change in an autocratic country, it ain't so pretty for the autocrat.
A different tank.
That's right. So just want you to know that we might be able to do this. So there's a question mark there. Is it wise to develop this capability as a deterrent, you know, and very carefully control it? And then there's a subordinate question to that is, would we be any good at it? And I would argue that we absolutely could be good at it because we have the best marketers in the world. You know, I'm on the board of Molson Coors, and you look at how those marketers work. It is insane how smart they are and how much they know. And they're not invading anybody's privacy in doing it. They just know what's going on. Well, we don't have that kind of expertise in the government, unfortunately.
But yeah, I think that's a big challenge. And by the way, shout out to Molson. I'm from Buffalo, and I drink Molson Canadian primary beer.
There you go.
So, yeah, I think you touched on a couple amazing points. I do think IO is different, but it's many times it's best delivered via some sort of cyber means. Right, it can be very.
You have to get through the
delivery.
firewall.
Yeah, delivery mechanism. But there is a difference. Like we talk about CNO, and that's really, you know, kind of offense, right? It's attack, defense, and really the exploitation or espionage phase, like information gathering. And I think one of the challenges with offensive weapons in the cyber domain is, first off, there isn't physics guiding them to the target many times, right? It's a lot of tricks here and there and playing on someone's lack of knowledge. And it's not like a Model T factory where it's a repeatable process all the time. It's very, very difficult. And the other thing is when it goes, it doesn't blow up, so you can't reconstruct the capability. you can
and
always
also,
reverse engineer the payloads.
Right. And like nuclear weapons, there's fallout sometimes, unintended consequences. You might get targets you really didn't mean to go after. And you'd like to avoid that. You try to design the tool to not do that, but you never know.
Yeah. I mean, hey, real world example of, the NotPetya worm, right? The Russians leveraged against the Ukrainians years ago. That one got loose, and I actually don't believe it was their intent. I could be wrong because it hit a lot of Russian companies too. And I think so to your point, you can, especially if you're.
That's back to the point about things can do short-term good, but long-term harm.
I'm with you. There's, obviously there's been several cases, but I really do think sometimes, especially in the early days, right? It was a sexy tool. It could be deployed. Yes, it was absolutely, Title 50 sort of, more covert action authorities. But what I was left with in some of its uses was like cool demonstration of tech, long-term intended outcome. You actually made them better. In some cases, in my opinion, and you would have been better served maybe using some more traditional approaches to disrupting operations. And
it's kind of asymmetric again in the information space. If China, let's say, wants to influence an election, they just come in through the front door.
Right.
For us to influence something in China, we would have to use a technical method probably to get through their firewall before you could do something like that. But that's all theoretical.
Right.
And then there's another type of asymmetry too. North Korea can come after our internet. Well, they don't have one to go after.
Not much of one.
So there's not much
really
asymmetric, or there's not a symmetrical response you can do there.
Right.
And so how do you approach that problem? But
it's really tricky. I mean, when you think about just-in-time logistics, just-in-time production, that's only enabled by one thing, which is network applications, right? And we're in the West way more reliant on it. China is obviously too, but there's real practical challenges with them. It's the language, the dialects, and the number of people that know it compared to the number of people that know English. They're able, in my opinion, to sift through a mountain more information than we're capable. And obviously, we had a huge contingent of Russian linguists in the 80s. We could probably use a lot more again. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's
but the Chinese are on the commercial side,
right?
Very, very adept at using artificial intelligence to do this. And there's a terrific book you probably read it, by Kai-Fu Lee, called AI Superpowers that talks about the sort of 4 things you have to do to be an AI superpower, and China has 3 of them locked down.
Right.
And they're pretty good at the 4th, and we only have 1 of them locked down, and we're not very good at anything else. So they have that commercial advantage. Whether that translates into a military or intelligence advantage, not really sure, but it's a world we have to fight hard. And Eric Schmidt and Bob Work and other people out there who are arguing forcefully for us to get further along in this are spot on. We have to compete.
Yeah, and this might be a terrible analogy, but I kind of feel like we're incredibly capable, and if our commercial sector had to kind of flip the bit, and more World War II style, and really help the kind of a national effort. The thing that worries me the most is I kind of feel like we're Japan and they're the U.S. in World War II, and if they got awoken with their production capacity, now their ability, a lot of it from stealing from us in the West, but they've now are innovating on their own fully. I feel like we have to have a moonshot Manhattan style project to bring back semiconductor manufacturing, at least to North America at a mass scale. I mean, I remember when COVID hit, I had to buy some new computer monitors. I mean, these damn things look like they're 15 years old because that's all we could get. And you look at that, and then kind of generic drug production. We don't have the capacity here either. Our military uses a lot of that stuff. It's I really feel like there has to be a national priority. And I saw the semiconductor bill or funding, but it seemed honestly like pissing on a wildfire.
I think there's a gradual it's a very gradual, but it's a gradual move in the direction you're talking about. And a lot of the companies that I talk to, I either suggested them or they were already telling me that they're willing to give up a point or two of margin in order to better solidify their supply chain, both in terms of having more than one supplier, but also more than one country. as in that supply chain, so that if something goes wrong, they can, maybe they scale up one of them, but not being so dependent on the supply chain. But semiconductors, we are so dependent on Taiwan. You're absolutely right. They've got to move, and the CHIPS Act is a drop in the bucket.
We need a lot more, because I really feel like when we've seen the impact of technology in a war, and we're going to get to that because we're watching it right now live in front of our face, and you've experienced it firsthand. You have to win the processing and communications game to develop the next generation of technology. And I think that's why I feel like the emergency was like 5 years ago, and it really needs to be a lot faster kind of progress and more urgency. But it's probably not a very exciting political topic, to be candid.
Yeah, but I think the Ukraine war is showing us some interesting things at several levels, if we'll only learn them. Yes, it is a slugfest on the ground, and yes, in World War II, I think 75% of the casualties were from artillery, and we're seeing that in Ukraine, and they're pounding on each other. But what we also saw was an example of small, smart, lethal things that were rendering large, slow, non-stealthy things pretty obsolete pretty quickly.
Right.
If you're using javelins and stingers and anti-ship cruise missiles and HIMARS.
Right.
It's tough if you're a tank driver or a helicopter pilot or a ship captain in range of one of those systems, and they're cheap and they're easy to make. So there's something we need to be paying attention to there. Right. And then something else that I think from the Ukraine conflict, we hopefully will learn, because it's getting harder and harder to envision a conventional conflict with China. I would argue right now that we're tailoring our assumptions to how we want to fight that conflict, rather than looking at real assumptions and figuring out how we really need to change in fighting that conflict. But one of the things we're seeing in Ukraine, I think, and I'm apolitical, but I'd give the Biden administration some credit for sort of employing all elements of national power. They've used diplomacy well, they've used economic power well, they've used intelligence power well, and flowing that into information warfare by releasing some of the sensitive technology that didn't stop the invasion, but it certainly kept our allies on board. The sensitive intelligence. And then on the military side, they decided to indirectly support Ukraine rather than directly support Ukraine.
Right.
And I think you're going to probably see that with Taiwan, as my guess. Why would we do one for one and not for the other? So what it shows you is that there's a whole of government answer to deterring China that is not necessarily targeting their military as a center of gravity, but is targeting their leadership. Because remember, their leadership, like we said earlier, you wake up in the morning and you're afraid of your people because regime change is not so good in those countries. So I think that we have an evolution that we need to force in this, because we made Ukraine up as we went along. You can't make up China as you go along. You have to be ready and have this in place now, and understand how you're going to do it, rather than living off of fanciful assumptions and the belief that we will go force on force with China, which we may not do.
Yeah. Let's hope it never
there's an answer
gets to that.
Let's hope
let's hope we can just work on making money.
Exactly. Right? And let them make some money too while we're at it, by the way.
Exactly. I think one thing that's been interesting, I think the Armenian kind of Azerbaijan skirmish was the first one where you started seeing kind of, not full drone swarming technologies, but definitely loitering munitions. And, it seems like just the ability, like you're seeing in Ukraine, to set up just command and control posts. They're incredibly vulnerable. Like the second you get them set up with precision munitions, and it feels like, I would think both in the naval sector, but I don't have experience in it, that we'd have to get a lot more high volume distributive platforms that we can, kind of push here and there and make it hard, instead of like such a center of gravity that can be targeted.
I also think that we also need to get serious about directed energy, and by directed energy, I don't necessarily mean lasers, because lasers have a couple of really big disadvantages. One, they take a lot of power, and it's hard to get the right power out of a laser to get the ranges that you really want. They don't like clouds, and the kinds of things you need to hit at long range are you're going to have to shoot through a cloud, which isn't going to work. And you have to have dwell time. You have to put that laser on that target for a long time. If you're using a high powered microwave, you don't have to worry about clouds. You don't have to worry about dwell time. And if you get ultra high powered microwaves, which are in the art of the possible, you can actually knock some stuff down pretty far away. So we're going to have to do that to augment the more kinetic defensive systems that we've got, if we hope to operate in that battle space, assuming we would even do that.
Yeah. You're the first person I've heard talk about that, actually, because it makes a ton of sense. If it moves to a lot more kind of highly accurate, distributed kinetic platforms that can, bring it. That's hard to defend by shooting projectiles. I mean, you really have to engage them in a different spectrum.
I'm also, John, a big advocate for reinvigorating our offensive mine warfare capability. If you were to do a deep dive on our current offensive mine warfare capability, you wouldn't get very deep because there's just not much there. It's kind of like dumb bombs with a sensor on them that only work in shallow water and only if something drives directly overhead. And when you think of the state-of-the-art technology that a Silicon Valley could bring to this problem, and network and machine learning and other forms of artificial intelligence and the like, it's incredible what you could do. And now, if you have a very, very bright networked set of offensive mines, the military can now be a contributing instrument of power where you can shut down commerce just by saying you have it. And you can select, I wouldn't hit a Chinese submarine. I'd hit maybe a Chinese merchant ship with a mission kill, not actually sinking it.
Sure.
There's a tremendous latent potential there. And the reason why we're not doing that is because there's no champion for it. There's no 4-star admiral in the Navy who grew up in an offensive mine warfare community. They're all either fighter pilots or submariners or surface ship drivers. So we've got to sort of, it takes real courage, I think, on the part of leaders to champion things that are culturally not necessarily there. And we've seen this in business many times. You just look at the digital camera, and the like, how the companies that actually invented those things didn't field them because they were worried about hurting their wet film franchise.
Kodak.
Yeah. Kodak. And gosh, if we do digital, we won't be able to sell wet film anymore. Not realizing that, somebody's going to do it. It might as well be you.
Yeah, might as well. So. How do you get there with the military? Because I'll just give you my experience in kind of the sector I worked in. Like when it comes to defense, and this is no offense to kind of our brothers and sisters in the IC, but cyber defense, I think the commercial world is light years ahead of the government. I really do believe that. Offense is a different story, just because.
Well, it's not their
one's
job.
illegal and one's not. Right? You have a monopoly on it because we become felonies every day. It seems to me the way the institutional inertia and some of the large defense contractors, just the comp structure of contractors in a lot of cases, I feel like we pay so much money for, frankly, a lot of convoluted sort of old thinking. How do we get the best of commercial into the government? That's the thing. I've never really seen it. You think about like what Elon Musk and SpaceX has been able to do. I mean, I just couldn't picture us pulling that off in the procurement infrastructure. So
there have been efforts, right? NQTEL and the intelligence community
they're great.
Is out there scouring Silicon Valley. DIUX, which Bob Work and I started in the DoD, has had fits and starts because the primes don't like them and it's hard to break into that world, and it's hard to get anything done fast in DoD, which DIUX was partly intended to do. And then you have over at the CIA, Nand Mulchandani, who's the new head of the technical guy over there. Is a brilliant guy from Silicon Valley who's hopefully going to help drag the agency.
I saw him.
Technically,
I saw him the release when he joined there. I was really happy about that.
I spent some time with him, and he's really fun to talk to. He's got a lot of really good ideas. So again, it takes leadership that is willing to not take no for an answer, that's willing to take a little bit of risk, that's willing to fail fast, that's willing to entertain not just I talk about 3 horizons of innovation, and they're not temporal. They're mental. The first horizon is sort of the small incremental improvements, but to your current concept. So make the radar see just a little further, make the weapon fly just a little further. The second horizon would be more disruptive change, but still to the same concept. So think stealth fighters, maybe laser guided bombs. The third horizon, which is the most difficult one to get to, is rethinking the entire concept. And that is extremely difficult for human beings to do, especially on the short timelines that our leaders are in their jobs. first they don't get a long time to learn their jobs, and then they got a problem they got to solve tonight rather than looking at the long term. And the tendency is when you have a problem to lunge for more means, not a new way.
Right.
And I think courageous visionary leaders are going to go, hey, we can do plan A with China for a little while longer, but we better start working on plan B now, not when plan A fails.
Right.
And that's what I'm hoping to see. It takes a special kind of Steve Jobs-like person to be able to do that.
It does. And sometimes, a crisis is the fastest way to drive it. But for some of these bigger things, it could take too long to get there.
You don't have time.
One example I read, and I don't know if it's true, but it's kind of innovation under pressure when you really need it is my understanding in Ukraine, you had traditional, artillery, right? They're old Soviet platforms. But between Starlinks and some of their comms, they were able to start making an application so they could call in artillery strikes in the early days and call it in with their cell phone, which I thought was incredibly brilliant.
Oh, yeah.
Way
and never
that between drones giving feedback on where the artillery is landing and being able to adjust. I thought that was just brilliant.
Yeah, never underestimate the ability of humans to, especially humans living in a free intellectual environment, to innovate and adjust and adapt. They can do it faster than you think. We adapted during COVID. The world has changed, and people have did it quicker than anybody ever thought. But still, but your point is right though. If you discover on day one of a war with China that your concept is all wrong, it's really hard to fix that because
those guys, it's probably too late. It's gonna be very hard.
And they're not gonna let us do what Saddam Hussein let us do, right? They're not going to give us 6 months to build up all our stuff and then decide to go. It's going to be like tonight. So we've talked. One of the things that we talked a lot about UAVs. I got to tell you a story.
Okay.
When I was before I could have USS Enterprise, I'd have my training wheels. My training wheels was USS Cleveland, which is an old amphibious warship, really old, and we deployed to the Arabian Gulf. But we had something on board that was new, and that was called a Pioneer UAV. The old Marine Corps, little propeller thing. And we had it, and we would launch it off the flight deck with JATO bottles, and we would catch it in a net. And it's like, what do we do with this thing? Well, it turns out that this whole intelligence world was looking for this radar on the Al-Fa Peninsula of Iraq that nobody could find. They had the electronic signature, but nobody could find it. Why? Because everything was still pictures. So our little UAV flies over and sees this thing rotating, video, boom. It's like, okay, there's a use for this thing. And then the next day it flies along and it finds an Iraqi surface-to-surface missile that was on the beach in the Al-Fa Peninsula, basically pointed right out to sea, and we were in its envelope. So it's like, turn around and run. And the very next day, I because we had cobbled together a Cypernet on the ship, which this old World War II ship wasn't supposed to have, but we kind of did it. We were able to send still pictures from our UAV of this basically Silkworm missile sitting on the beach back to 5th Fleet headquarters. And the next day, a bunch of F-18s went out and blew it up while our UAV was watching. So imagine you're on this like old backwater Navy ship that has Marines on it. And, it's like a clunky old ship. And you're able to show your crew a video of what you guys found using this system, and it's getting blown up by F-18s. Was that a cool moment for the crew? Yes. But what it was also was a big moment for me. That was long before there was anything called a Predator or a Reaper, but it was a very early example to me of the power of unmanned systems. It was pretty cool time.
I want to get into Ukraine here, but I have a question I've never been able to ask anyone. It seems to be one of the biggest challenges, especially, when you have such high precision munitions. Okay, you're going up against a peer. There's a ground war going on. You have loitering munitions. You got GPS guided artillery. It's going to be hard to spend too much time anywhere, right? It seems like logistics of delivering supplies and materials is one of the most important things, and something the Russians seem to have really messed up. And you heard about at the steel plant in Mariupol, these hyper dangerous helicopter missions trying to resupply those guys, flying right off the deck. Do you think there's a place for low observable unmanned cargo craft? And if so, why doesn't it seem like we're developing absolute massive fleets of these things? Because it feels like, now maybe they're too large, but it feels like you would want a way to deliver, materials to ground troops that have to be on the move all the time in a highly contested environment. How do you do that?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I know that the ground services are experimenting with unmanned cargo delivery systems, helicopters.
Oh, they are good.
But are they stealthy or not? It's hard to make a helicopter stealthy. It's doable to a certain extent, but at least it's unmanned. So if it gets shot down, you're not losing a person, or people. But you're absolutely right. And the Russian army has betrayed itself as a very unprofessional force, not only on the battlefield itself with their infantry, their armor, what have you, where they're not even picking up their dead off the battlefield,
right?
That sort of thing, but also in their logistics. And they had the old Soviet logistics system that was utterly dependent on rail, and has just been flattened by the Ukrainians. And then when they try to adjust, the Ukrainians adjust and are going after their logistics nodes. So I know that our military thinkers are looking very closely at exactly the question you're asking us: is how do you not only do battlefield logistics on land, but how do you do it, let's say, in the Western Pacific? How do you get new supplies out there, both for, let's say, Marines on remote islands, or Air Force aircraft that have been dispersed to an island, or how do you do that safely? Is a very important question. And there's the old saying, logistics is for operations is for amateurs, logistics is for professionals, or what have you.
Right.
It really is true.
I mean, I've read the stories about just delivering Thanksgiving dinner to the troops in Afghanistan, like the absolute massive effort it is to get that stuff across the world, not have it spoil. I mean, it seems like in a lot of hyper contested environments in a pure, it's like you probably need low observable cargo platforms and a lot of probably either manned or unmanned, especially in the sea, kind of underwater platforms to get things there. Because
and logistics in Afghanistan is a really good example. There were a lot of different ways that our remote, forward operating bases got their logistics, and some of it was convoys, but you can only take a convoy so far in Afghanistan before it gets blown up. Right. And a lot of it was helicopters operating in high mountainous areas that are not friendly to helicopters, and the dollars per mile per pound of trying to fly something in with a helicopter is vastly different than the dollars per mile per pound from a truck, and everything in between. So it's a big animal that we got to be looking at.
So kind of onto the current events in Ukraine. What's your assessment so far, and what the heck is the end game here? It seems like a really thorny one.
So first of all, we know that there are reasons why Putin did what he did, and we can get into that. Obviously his personal paranoia, his desire for, being the most famous Russian leader ever, protecting the Slavic civilization, all the things that, and being afraid of NATO. We know that he made three really bad assumptions in the beginning. One is that his military was capable and competent, and able to walk into Kyiv. Another was that bad assumption was how the Ukrainians were going to resist, both their will and their skill. Two different and very important things, their will and their skill. And then third, of course, was the reaction of the Western world, because we had not really reacted very much, candidly, to when he invaded Georgia, when he took Crimea, when he tries to kill people in UK. It was like a little slap on the wrist. So he thought this was going to happen again, and it didn't. This was a psychological moment for Europe and for the rest of the world, and he wasn't expecting that. So, and they also made the cardinal sin of contempt for their adversary. They had contempt for the Ukrainian military, which had, in fact, since 2014, really been professionalizing.
Right.
And, our state partnership program, National Guard of Florida, over there training them every day. Partner nations in Europe training them every day. And they developed an NCO corps, and they, all that sort of thing. So that failed. And that was phase one. Phase two is when Putin deftly shifted the strategic objectives just to the Donetsk and Luhansk region and, the southern part of Ukraine to make the land bridge to Crimea. And that's when they took on the scorched earth policy of basically destroy a town with artillery and then move in with your infantry. And that worked for a while.
Syria and Chechnya again.
It worked for a while. And then phase 3 is when the Ukrainians kind of gathered all this momentum of mobilizing their own population, training their own population, getting some seriously capable weapons like the HIMARS, which can hit a table from 40 miles away. That's a pretty decent weapon.
Yeah.
And now you find that the Russians reach a culminating point. They're exhausted, they're tired, and the Ukrainians are just basically sending them packing. Right. So that's phase 3. The most dangerous phase now is phase 4, where Putin is having to double down. And the problem for him, if you're a far right leader, an autocrat, and you can just shoot people in the streets and nobody can do anything about it, not a problem if you bog down in Ukraine. If you're a democratic leader, well, there's an election and you get thrown out of office and you go work in a think tank, like we talked about earlier.
Right.
If you're Putin, who does not have absolute freedom to operate inside Russia, he's got a lot and he controls the information environment, but doesn't have total freedom. He's starting to feel it from the right now, from the hardliner Russian people, and that's a dangerous place for him because they could take him out and he could end up in one of those bad places. So he's having to double down. And you see it with the call up of more than 300,000 people.
Oh yeah.
With the nuclear saber rattling, with the annexation of the territories, and it's at a very dangerous place right now. So where does it go? And that the big overhanging question is there a face-saving way out for Putin that the Ukrainians and the West can live with? Right. And at the moment, it's very hard to envision that. Yeah. Peskov, Putin's spokesman the other day, sort of dropped a little bit of a hint, maybe, that was, when we're talking about these territories, it's the parts that we currently occupy.
Right.
I was like, okay, is that a little bit of a walk back?
The start, yeah.
But it's going to be hard for Zelensky to agree to that, especially when they've got the momentum, the offensive momentum.
Well, the momentum and just the sheer atrocities they committed on the civilian population.
Yeah, so you could visualize a settlement where you give Russia, maybe what they had before 2014 or where they are now, and then where Ukraine is not necessarily going to come into NATO, but there are actually bilateral agreements between Ukraine and some pretty important countries where you ain't coming any further, Putin, after this negotiation. And you could visualize that, but there are a couple of sticking points there. Russia will want sanctions relief if this happens. And the West will not relieve those sanctions as long as war crimes are hanging out there. Russia is not cooperating on prosecuting those because Putin himself is guilty of war crimes, and rebuilding Ukraine, the cost of rebuilding Ukraine. So it's just a very complicated soup, and it's hard to visualize an mutually acceptable answer there. So it's going to be a drawn out conflict unless and until Putin decides to escalate severely, either inside Ukraine or outside Ukraine or both. Mm-hmm. So inside Ukraine, what does that look like? Well, he could do a nuclear test someplace to kind of drop the hint a little harder. He could do chemical weapons. He could go after more civilian targets and just make it hell in there. That's inside Ukraine. Outside Ukraine, we think that he destroyed those pipelines. Well, there's other things he can take out too, like transatlantic cables, and he could start to have impact outside. So where does he go? It would be great if there was a face-saving way out for both him and Ukraine.
It's that golden bridge to retreat across, right?
And that's not looking very golden stuff right now. Yeah.
No. I think that's the biggest concern is when you have someone so desperate. Yeah, he's in a no-win situation at this point, both with and you never know. Like, let's say he gets taken out, and it's the super ultra nationalist hardliners. What do we get after that,
Yeah. So what it looked like, okay, Putin, here's the deal. You go back to where you were on February 24th. You can have that. You cooperate with war crimes. The $300 billion in assets you have overseas are reset. And then we will unravel the sanctions in an exchange that is what I call, when we were negotiating with Iran, release or reversible for reversible and irreversible for irreversible. Right. So we'll meter some sanctions out as once you give us a war criminal. We will meter some sanctions off once we have possession of that $300 billion and we can now use it to rebuild Ukraine. So it's just got to be very cleverly done. But I don't. It's going to be hard to visualize.
Yeah, it's unclear the Ukrainians accept any of that territory.
Imagine what would happen to the stock market tomorrow, though, if this happened.
It would be it would be good. I mean,
That's what I'm looking for.
Kind of concerns me. Like you have obviously inflation's off the rails. We're making cost of borrowing way higher, but there's so many factors that will cause inflation totally outside the control of monetary policy. China's one COVID policy or whatever it's called, no COVID.
And just the upward spiral, one guy raises prices, another guy has to. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
the Saudis
like
just
you, I
gave us a thank you.
Yeah. How about that? That's unfortunate.
Yeah.
You saw that there's a move in Congress to pull all of our patriots home from Saudi Arabia because of this.
Yeah. Well, that
once again, Congress tries to do foreign policy.
I know. You gotta love it. I think that's some of the challenges in these negotiations. It's like I look at the first Iran deal, right? Mm-hmm. And I get it kind of lengthened some time there, but in the meantime, I also look at the fuel cycle's been mastered, and the accuracy of the delivery platforms is significantly better than it ever was. And so it's that last physics package piece, which, I think a lot of damage has been done to that infrastructure, by others in this world. But, that's kind of you don't want to find yourself in the same situation, whatever this kind of next outcome is. I think that was a really, really tough situation to be in with them, right or wrong. I'm not casting judgment on the initial deal, but, the economy was in rough shape at the time that deal was struck. And, it's not clear that we solved anything big picture.
We were getting visibility into their program though, which was really important. We had monitors there, and they were sticking to the agreement.
Yeah.
And when we backed out of that, we went blind in many respects, and they now start to diversify their program, and they're enriching, and they're a lot closer to that breakout point now than they would have been. And I think people were worried about the sort of 10-year horizon or whatever. But there's nothing wrong with saying, okay, we're getting close to year 10. Time to extend this thing.
Something new.
If you don't extend it, sanctions are coming back on because the agreement's over, right? Same thing with like a START treaty. When the START treaty's over, or you negotiate a new one.
Right.
Not going to negotiate with this guy anytime soon, but
I'm not sure they ever. I think they adhered to parts of these treaties. On the Russian
selective.
Side.
Well, you saw the INF treaty went away, obviously, because we tried for years to get them to back off their violations. Right. And at some point, you have to declare reality and say, okay, they're just going to keep doing this. Then treaty's done. Right.
Treaty's done. So, Admiral, one last plug for your own podcast. I know it sounds incredible. You've had some fantastic guests. What's it called? How do people tune in?
Sure. It's called The Adrenaline Zone. You can find it on Spotify, Apple, or any place that you get your podcasts. We have a website that was temporarily down today, but it's theadrenalinezone.com.
Okay.
And it's about people who take risk, and we're having an awful lot of fun with it. We're starting season 3 soon, and we're going to have a bull rider in season 3. I can't wait to talk to Shane.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Who's going to be there. We have a nuclear submariner. We have Tom Pritzker, who is not only the chairman of Hyatt, he's also, little known fact, one of the world's archaeological experts in a little part of the Himalayas. So he's been out there, and I think he's been captured by the Taliban, and all that. So he's got a real story to tell, and we like people who've taken 2 different types of risk. And we've got a female gamer.
Really?
And she's fantastic. Rebecca Brock Dixon, who is.
I can't imagine all the crap that has said to her over the years. That online gaming community. Obviously I love gaming, but
there's 3.5 billion gamers in this world, and half of them are women. I never realized that until I talked to Rebecca.
Realized it.
And so she's got 650,000 people. She has a startup going called
Unbelievable.
The game Hers, THE game, and then Hers, that is trying to support women gamers. And it's really fascinating person to talk to.
That's fantastic. She should be proud. Who'd be amazing for your show, and I don't remember his name, so I apologize. But there's a Netflix documentary on the gentleman that climbed some of the he tried to do a record of climbing I don't know what it was, the top 7 or more tallest peaks in the world. And it was, the documentary was unbelievable.
Yeah, we had Jimmy Chin lined up, and he gets so busy we haven't had a chance to reattack. But he's the producer of the film Free Solo.
Oh,
I didn't necessarily want to talk to the gent that was the climber.
Alex.
I wanted to talk to Jimmy, about what was it like to do this and all the other things that Jimmy does, amazing films that he puts together.
Right.
So we're open to see if we can reattack and get him. And of course, we're going to do Santa Claus at the end of this season.
Oh, fantastic!
Hey, Santa Claus takes a lot of risk, right? I mean, let's face it. Going down chimneys, and that sort of thing is a little risky.
Flying at breakneck speeds across the world.
And I'm pretty sure he's going to have a lot of good Santa puns for us. So stay tuned for that episode.
I'm sure. Well, sir, thank you so much for your service to our country, your time today, and all the great work you're doing on your own podcast to tell the stories of those that take risks. Because last time I checked, you don't do anything great without taking some significant risk. So these stories need to be told because they're inspiration for the next generation of risk takers.
No risk, no champagne. But